the Mount Penn Preserve trails, and just going to take a look at some interesting structure of an old wine cellar which is in the woods. The abandoned wine cellar is known as Keuchler's Roost. There's a map at the parking lot that shows a whole trail network. We're going to be taking this red path up to the abandoned wine cellar and Keuchler's Roost. Now, I haven't figured out a good way to stabilize the camera yet, but I'll show you a little bit of the path leading down to the abandoned wine cellar. Jacob Louis Keuchler moved to Reading in the early 1870s, and these details can be found on this plaque next to the abandoned wine cellar, which you just saw go by on the left-hand side. Here is the plaque. So he moved to Reading in the early 1870s. He opened a bar at 523 Penn Street. In 1882, he bought this land on the mountain with the vineyard and the building. Turns out he was planning on just operating the vineyard and being relatively alone, but people started visiting him. They knew him from his days of running the bar on Penn Street and basically developed into a restaurant. In the 1890s, a gravity railroad was built and it became a railroad stop. In 1904, Keuchler passed away. In 1905, a Karl Scheich bought the place, and he made improvements, even at one point having a bowling alley in that building. But in 1919, a fire destroyed it. And also, I think it was a victim of Prohibition. The idea of Prohibition wasn't really compatible with going up on the mountain and doing wine tastings. So you also notice in that plaque, the building is shown next to the wine cellar, but I'm wondering if that's actually a composite picture, because when you look back there, there's no foundation obvious from the building. So that I'm not 100% sure if the building is shown in its proper relation to the wine cellar. I want to point out some interesting things about the wine cellar itself. Notice it's mostly covered by dirt in the back, but comes up in the front. It looks to me like he probably built wooden forms and then laid the stone and brick on top of that in an archway. It's mortared, and notice these iron hardware where there used to be doors. Now, the place itself looks a little dangerous to enter, and it just, granted, it is built in 1870, so it's quite old, and it hasn't been maintained in about 100 years, roughly. But there's a crack running through the top, and I think what's basically really caused this to occur is the absence of the door is letting all of this masonry experience all the temperature changes. And I think water has gotten in here and frozen and started to bust these stones apart. You can see there's still a lot of mortar present, but an awful lot of mortar is missing. There's vegetation growing, which is eating away at the mortar. And anyhow, some of the mortar is still there, but an awful lot of it is totally gone. And I'm thinking if the door had still been here, that inner part of the archway would not have experienced the temperature fluctuations. It might be in a whole lot better shape. We got some moss growing, which is also taking its toll on the mortar. And it's kind of a fascinating just to watch how the structure is aged and deteriorated. Here we got some plants growing out of the side of the wall. It looks like a small tree is trying to grow out of there, and you see how the mortar is pretty much totally missing except for a few places. So this is the side of the building, and then you'll notice it goes underground. So the underground part should be at a constant 54 degrees, except for whatever cold air can go in through the opening. So had the door been there, I think the whole thing would have been more temperature stable and probably be in a lot better shape. Anyhow, that's Keuchler's Roost, which is an interesting place to visit if you're either hiking or mountain biking in Mount Penn.